Well, my marker is on page 342, where it talks about writing clear objectives. What are clear objectives? Did I give you the stuff from page 342?
About Bloom's taxonomy? Or what?
No, I gave you that earlier about performing a task analysis.
No.
No, we didn't talk about
I
that.
think so.
In planning lessons, it says on page 342, it's important to consider the skills required in the task to be taught or assigned. For example, you might ask students to use the internet to write a brief report on some topic. The task seems straightforward enough, but consider the separate skills involved. They have to know how to find information on the internet. They have to know how to make judgments about the worth of articles on the internet. They have to know how to find the main idea in an article or a piece of literature. They have to plan for how they're going to put their report together. And then they have to write paragraphs that clearly express what they're trying to say. So there's a whole bunch of tasks that a student has to perform. When I gave you those triangles and said measure the angles, I didn't realize that we should have had a lesson on how to use a protractor. But, see, you guys are smart enough to figure it out. And if you made a mistake on it, you were smart enough to figure out what kind of mistake you made and correct your mistake. So it's like, all right, I didn't plan time for that, but it took a little longer because we needed to do that. But it was just a task that I just kind of assumed you knew and found out you didn't. So that means I have to make some adjustments in what I'm doing when I'm teaching. And the idea here is that when you're, because this is a chapter on writing, what they call this, performing a task analysis. In terms of writing a lesson plan, you're trying to think of all the things the kids should know how to do before we get there. And my experience has been that I almost always get surprised by somebody who doesn't have some prerequisite skill, and I realize I'm just going to have to teach them that skill if we're going to get this information learned, if we're going to accomplish the task at hand. Bottom of page 342, that probably would be a good page to, what is that you call that stuff?
Screenshot.
Screenshot. Yeah, that would probably be a good page to screenshot. Because down at the bottom of the page it says, the process of breaking tasks or objectives down into their simplest components is called task analysis. Identify the prerequisite skills, identify the component skills, and then plan how the component skills are going to be assembled, put together into the final skill. And guess what I discovered when watching you guys do that circumference divided by diameter thing? That I couldn't do that with children who didn't have the dexterity to roll a circle down a yardstick and measure it, which is gets a little bit complicated. Backward planning. What is backward planning? Oh, I'm sitting here thinking I'm trying to figure out where people are going to sit, and then I didn't take attendance. Let me mark you here, Emily. 12, and Hannah, 12, and Hannah, 12, and Carissa, 12, and Cherish, 12. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Well, he gets to sit here. Good. All right. Put that over there and talk about backward planning. What is backward planning? I start out with my broad objectives. Then I go from there to my unit objectives. Then I go from there to my lesson objectives. Then I go from there to my measurable behavioral objectives. And what is it I'm trying to write? Behavioral objectives. You know that thing I gave you with all the verbs on it? I'm using that to write these objectives. Okay, so here I am working on a lesson plan, writing these objectives. Why did they call this backwards? It seems to me like that's not backwards. That's where you would start. Well, but see, it's like if this is where I'm working, I need to back up. I need to back into the bigger picture. Because most people don't walk in the room and start looking at the big picture and then breaking it down. They jump right on the task at hand. And so they call that backward planning, where I simply am moving backward from where I am. And page 343 gives an example of backward planning. So basically it's like, what am I trying to do in this? What do I want to accomplish in this class? And see, I just have to do this with math. You guys have to do this with every subject. But do you have to start from scratch and reinvent the wheel? I mean, this class is a brand new class for me this semester. Okay, so what did I do? Well, the textbook had already been selected. So I looked at the textbook and said, okay, big picture. How much time am I going to allocate to each chapter in the book to cover this? Then, next thing, what kind of units do I have? Chapter units. Each chapter has what? Okay, what kind of things am I going to have you do? I could have you do what I do in other classes. I could have you typing a one-page single-space summary for each chapter of what you gleaned from the chapter. I didn't require you to do that, did I? What did I substitute for that? MyLab. Because I looked through this book and I said, hey, MyLab's got chapter test on it. It's got these little things on it that you click on. It's got everything that I would be doing. So I just said, just have the students buy the package. And you guys go, ouch, is there any way we can share a package? Nope. Everybody has to have their own little MyLab membership so you can do this work. But look what it did for me. It just, then my job, once I've got the whole big picture lined up, now I just go through the chapter and highlight the stuff that I want to talk about in class to reinforce what you're getting from your reading and from your quizzes and from the MyLab exercises. That's my intent. So now you guys have been taking a class on how to do this stuff. Has it been working? Or maybe I should ask this way, because some of you have been in a class with me where have you been in a class where the professor tells you to write a one-page summary? Okay, so if you've been in classes where you have to write summaries, so from your perspective, since you're preparing to be teachers, would writing a one-page summary for each chapter of this book have been more valuable to you than what you've been doing on MyLab? I mean, I'm not going to change the rules here at the end of the game. It's already determined how we're going to do it this semester. I'm just asking so that if they ask me to teach this class again someday, I would know whether to use MyLab again or do something else.
I think I said this last week. It's good if you keep up with it, but if you get behind it, it becomes pretty overwhelming.
And you know what? I've got people in some of my classes who are way behind in writing their summaries too. And are they overwhelmed?
But I think it's less overwhelming to be behind in MyLab than it is to be behind on summaries because
there's
it's different. I mean, and it depends on the student.
Because it's a different. That's right. Because like I can get into
it's a different type of assessment.
I can get into the mode of writing summaries and just run through the book and write summaries.
Yeah.
But MyLab has a whole bunch of different stuff going on.
Yeah.
Which What?
Although summaries you have to kind of internalize at least a little bit to know what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
You can kind of, if you don't want to pay attention, you kind of can just find the information and plug it in. But, I mean, you should read it, but that doesn't mean everyone always does.
But, and see, and that's true, what you said. And that's why I have students write those summaries, because it does make them internalize and interact with it. But I just assumed, since you guys are all teachers, and this is educational psychology, that you would already have a high level of interest in internalizing this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
That might have been a faulty assumption on my part. No, it's not this it's psych that you guys don't have that much interest in. It's my math examples that are wearing you. That's what's bogging you down. But I can't help that because math is what I teach. But because you have so many other things going on at the same time, sometimes you're not able to give as much of your attention to something you would like to do. I've got something I wrote down that I want to do before Friday. But when I get home today, I won't have time to do it because I have to go watch a grandson wrestle. And then hopefully I'll find time to do it tomorrow because I want to share some cool stuff with you that the textbook talks about in the next chapter. But we only have one day to do it. But I also wanted to do some more of those little hands-on things with you. But I ran out of time for that too. So you see, it's just like you do something and then you say, okay, how did this work? And what do I do next time? Do I make some changes in the way I do it? Or do I do a little bit of my lab and a little bit of chapter summaries? Pick some chapters that you really need to digest the content, and other chapters let you use my lab for it. I mean, you say, yeah, but do we have to pay for the whole MATLAB to do part of it? Yeah, you do. And that's part of what I decided when I realized I was making you spend that money. I thought, boy, if I'm making them spend this money for my lab, I better make sure I use it. Because that would be a shame, wouldn't it, to have you buy my lab and then just say, oh, you don't have to do very much of it. Then it's like, well, why do you make us buy it? So it's just, and again, I'm just sharing with you what goes on in your head when you're trying to make your lesson plans. Okay? So that takes care of page 343. Let's go to 344. Planning courses, units, and lessons. Before the students arrive for the first day of class, you need to have a general plan of what will be covered all year in each unit and in each lesson. Well, let's see. Since this is the first time I taught this and you're going to go out there and be a first-time teacher, you probably won't have all of that nailed down at the first day of class. Because it's obvious to you, isn't it, that I've been coming in here and working on this about a chapter ahead of where we are in the class in terms of putting my lessons together for the next class. And you'll probably be doing some of that too. A lot of the stuff you do, you'll inherit it from the school system or the people who came before. You'll have that stuff. When I'm given a class to teach, the first thing I do is look at what the teacher who taught it before me did and try to do the same thing the first time around before I change things, just because I want to maintain continuity in the educational setting. 344. One thing they said, write a unit test as part of the planning process. Why would it be important to write your test while you're doing unit planning?
Because then make sure you cover it.
What?
Then you'll make sure that you cover it.
You want to make sure you're covering it when you teach your lessons. And as you're making your unit plan, you want to make sure that the big ticket stuff is stuff you're asking questions about. Yeah, but sometimes big ticket stuff doesn't lend itself to nice little multiple choice questions. Well, then does every assessment have to be a multiple choice test? Can't I give them something else to do that would be a reflection of that? One of my chapters in psychology talks about people becoming a whole person and all it's involved in becoming a well-rounded person. And it's like, how would I test them on that? Have everybody write, I think it's like a 5 or 6 page history of your pilgrimage to wholeness. You start out talking about when you were a little kid and all the influences in your life that made you the person you are today. And when you get to school and church, you just keep talking about it and keep typing. And then you just keep going till you have 5 or 6 pages of your life story. You follow what I'm thinking? That, to me, is an assessment of how well they've got a handle on that chapter. And the one thing I add is that the book doesn't talk about the spiritual dimension, so be sure and put that in your report. Talk about who's contributed to your spiritual growth and development as well. Okay, so think about your assessments when you're making your unit plans. Writing a test in advance helps you focus on the important issues to be covered. Whoa, who just said that? Hannah? That's right out of the textbook, Hannah. Isn't that nice to know that great minds run in the same channel? Yours and the author of our textbook? Or did you read that in the book and it just popped in your head when I asked that question?
Well, I read it, but I've also heard it in other classes.
All right. And see, it's like, sometimes I get confused. Was that original thought with me, or did I just pick that up from all the reading I do? And do I need to give somebody credit for it, but I don't know who it is? The test you prepare as part of your course planning might not be exactly the test you give at the end of the unit. I am so glad he said that, because it could be by the time I get to the end of that unit and I see what's going on in the classroom, I might decide that there's something these students need to do. I might make a change in my plan. Like when I was teaching government, and it was a time when the government was in a mess, kind of like it is now. This would be a tough time to teach government, because who's interested in government with all the ugliness going on? So I said, wait a minute, let's take another approach to this. They're supposed to learn how government operates. They're not going to learn that from watching what's going on in Washington. So let's just make up our own little government in class and practice doing what lawmakers ought to be doing in Washington. And all of a sudden, we took our focus on the ugliness up there and began to focus on reading the content of the chapter and understanding it well enough to practice it right in our classroom. And it was really fun. Of course, you have to understand, I'm an adventuresome spirit. I like to do fun things. And I will tell you this, in lesson planning, whenever I plan a lesson where I'm going to do something that's a little bit outside the box, I always take a backup lesson, so that if it starts to fall apart and malfunction, I'm not just at a loss. I say, I have someplace else to go where we can do something else. But I'm glad he told us that I might not use all the stuff I planned up front. Many texts provide unit tests and objectives. Sample objectives and tests are available from the state and local departments of education, and they can be found on the internet. So you can collect information about objectives for a subject at a certain grade level just by going to the internet, by finding out what the local school district requires, by looking at the textbook. I mean, okay, my college math course, look how easy it is for me to put that together. The textbook already has a practice test at the end of each chapter, and the practice test should represent, okay, shouldn't the practice test get them ready for the real test on Friday? So what do you think happens when I notice that there's something on the practice test that's not going to be on the real test? I just said it today in class. I took, 4 or 5 problems, and what did I say? Skip these problems. They are not going to be on the exam.
Mm-hmm.
Wasn't that comforting to know that? I mean, and you don't know how painful that was for me to do that, because those are cool problems, those ones we skip. I love doing those kind of problems. But, you see, I have to put my interest and feelings aside and say, no, these students are trying to get a handle on some pretty complicated stuff. You need to narrow it down, because let them know this is how you get ready for the test. And then there are some things on the test that the practice test doesn't get you ready for. So I mentioned, listen to me, when it says look for the solution set as opposed to the solution, there will be two answers, and one of them's right and one of them's wrong, and they both have the same numbers in them. And how do you know which one is right? When it says set, it's got those beautiful little scribbles around the outside. What are those called?
Braces.
Parentheses?
Braces.
What? Braces?
Brackets.
Those little, yeah, braces.
The ones like this are brackets.
Brackets are the little square things, and the braces are the cute little things. They're so cute. And they go with the word set. And if the question asks for the set, you be sure and mark that one. I know some students go, picky, picky, picky. But see, okay, that's another one of my course objectives. The reason I'm using the publisher's standardized test is because after you finish my math class, probably the only other time in life you'll have to demonstrate proficiency in math is when you take a test that's written like the one that's printed by the publisher.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a number of students have learned this semester that sometimes I know math better than the test reflects because of the way the test asks the question.
Mm-hmm.
And I want you to learn my ultimate goal is for you to learn how to present your ability to do math in such a way that the test actually reflects that ability. Which means we have to learn something about test taking. Okay. So now we're ready for page 345. What did I put? 345. If you prepare unit tests from scratch, use the guide to test construction presented later in this chapter. We'll get to that. So if you're going to put a test together from scratch, follow those test construction guidelines. Assessment should measure the degree to which students have learned the objectives set out for them. The greater the overlap between what was taught and what is tested, the better the students will score on the test. And when I have a whole bunch of people, I don't think the people in math class even know this, but now since you're in this class, you'll learn this. I have all those tests at home. And during the summertime, I will pull them out and I will go through them and identify which questions were missed, which kind of wrong answers were chosen by how many people. And I'll do an analysis of what's going on with that exam and why are people choosing that answer. And sometimes, okay, we've already talked about, maybe we haven't talked about it yet, but do all of you know that after I give a math test, I give the test back and let you correct it? Have you heard about me doing that? Have you ever had a math teacher any place in the world do that?
I think I had one of mine.
I never had anybody do that for me. But my reason for doing it is because if you made a mistake on the test, I want you to know what mistake you made, and you can come in and I'll actually help you figure it out on the board, won't I? I'll actually help. In a sense, my wife would say, you work the problem for them. I say, yes, I do. So I can help them see where their thinking was wrong. And sometimes students come in, and it's just like one of the questions on a recent test was, is this number a prime number? And I said, do you have your prime number chart with you? And what do you think they said? No. I'm going, did I tell you to bring your prime number chart to the test? Yes. And you just decided not to? I just forgot it. So now when I make a note that a lot of people miss that one, what do I write down? See what I learned about teaching from interacting with helping students correct their test? I learned what's going on. And I learned what kind of things I need to spend more time teaching more effectively. So it helps me improve the next time around I teach the class. And hopefully, every time I teach it, I get a little better at what I'm doing, so I make up for some of those errors from the past. But I'll just tell you right now as a teacher, sometimes the culture we live in changes. Since I've been using this same book since 1980, new editions of it, but it's the same textbook and the same publisher and the same strategy. Then what that means is that sometimes people have come into my class with background deficiencies that they didn't have in years past. Or that people overcame background deficiencies because of the way math was being taught, and then came in with some other weaknesses that maybe were never talked about. Like in terms of understanding why the three corners of a triangle torn off always add up to 180, or understanding the Pythagorean theorem and things like that. So since there's not as much understanding, I mean, I never used to put on the board that right triangle with that 3, 4, 5 with the little squares attached to it, that the side 3 is 9, the side 4 is 16, the side 5 is 25, and voila, 9 plus 16 equals 25. Pythagoras discovered that, and that's kind of what he was looking at when he saw it, and he talked about it and tested it with other numbers, and sure enough, it works with all the numbers. So it's just like you have to make some adjustments based on what's going on in the class from time to time when you teach it. Okay, I already gave you Bloom's taxonomy from page 346. Well, then how come I have another one in here? Well, because I gave you a different taxonomy page. So look what I have here. Whoops, is that one got stuff on the back? You don't want that one. You want this one. That one's fine. You want a good one. And I've given you this page primarily so you'll know where it comes from, so you can go to the internet and download it if you want to. It's called Bloom's taxonomy. What domain is it?
The effective one.
So what was the other domain?
Ineffective, apparently.
You say, I don't know. It was the cognitive domain. Does this page talk about cognitive domain, psychomotor, and affective? Yeah, it does. Look at the bottom of the page while I'm handing this next handout out. And read about those three domains. Cognitive was the one that I gave you yesterday, or the last class period. Cognitive has to do with your head, cogs turning, wheels turning. Affective has to do with your affections. And what do you think psychomotor has to do with?
Something with psychology?
Psychomotor. What would be a motor skill?
Holding a pencil.
Walking,
Writing.
writing, keyboarding, penmanship,
Playing on the playground.
playing on a playground, playing a sport. So I gave you the other day the cognitive stuff. But I want you to also address the affective. And what's the affective domain? Let's see, what did I just give you? Man. What does this handout say? Category. And what are the categories? Look at the first handout I gave you. Look at this page right here. For those online, look at this page right here and see the categories. What are the categories? Real small print right in the middle of the page. What's the first one?
Internalizing values.
Right, and what's the one underneath it?
Organization.
And underneath that?
Valuing.
And underneath that?
Response to
And underneath that?
using.
And guess what? It's upside down. what do you do first? Do you first internalize the value, or do you receive the phenomena? Okay, here's the phenomena. Ephesians 6, 1 and 2. What does it tell children to do?
Obey their parents.
Do what?
Obey their parents.
Is that what Ephesians 6, 1 and 2 tells you to do? You go, I don't know. So, okay, if you don't know, what would you do?
Look it up.
Look it up. And then you would do what? Prerequisite skill. Read it. And what does it say when you read it? You don't have it handy there?
This is the first commandment with promise. So
Is that what it says? Ephesians 6:1 says,
obey your parents.
children, do what?
Obey your parents in the Lord. For this is the first commandment with promise, I think.
Well, it's the first commandment with promise. That what?
That you may live.
I mean, this is pretty heady stuff for little kids. That you might do what?
That it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land.
Yeah.
That it may go well with you and that you might live long in the land. And then what's it say next?
Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in discipline.
Does it say anything in that Ephesians 6:1 about honoring your parents?
Verse 2, honor your father.
Oh, so it's to obey them and honor them. And so the little kid says, so what does it mean to honor, Mr. Bonine? And I say, well, first let's talk about what does it mean to obey? And what is it? Now you see what I'm doing? I'm not internalizing down here. I'm down at the bottom working my way up. I'm asking him to be receptive. Okay, and here's how I checked your receptivity. I had you read it. And I'm looking at your reactions to see how you feel about it. And none of you seem to be offended. Like the little guy in my class who said, Mr. Bonine, I said, so what's it mean to obey your parents? And someone said, it means do what they tell you. I said, that's a good translation. You see, that's someone who's demonstrating understanding. I said, and you should do what they tell you all the time. And some little guy goes, Mr. Bonine, it does not say obey your parents in all things. Those were his exact words. Would anybody like to pull up Colossians 3:20 and read it?
Sure.
I had this little guy, I handed him a Bible, and I said, turn over to Colossians 3:20 and read that verse out loud for the whole class to hear. What does it say?
Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord.
Oh, now see, I'm thinking that when God inspired Scripture, he knew this little squirrel in my classroom was going to shoot his mouth off and say that. And he gave me just the answer to that. That's why you want to keep reading through the Bible, to become familiar with Scripture. And so I turned him over there and had him read it. And it's just like he goes, oh, man. Now, see, I'm looking at these kids. So is everybody receiving what God just told them to do? Or are some people going, I don't think I like that idea? I even one time had a class that was so unreceptive to what God had to say that I said, it looks like we're going to have to do an experiment. And half of you are going to go home this weekend and just do what you normally do. And the other half are going to go home and all weekend you're going to you're going to obey your parents no matter what they tell you to do without any question, without any hesitation. And you're even going to honor them by asking if there's anything I can do to help you after you finish doing what they told you to do. You just look at them and say, Mom, Dad, is there anything else I can do to help? I mean, what child does that? And I had trouble getting half the class to be my experimental group who would go home and practice this stuff so we could come back next week and talk about what happened. And does this surprise anybody? That the kids who went home and practiced this little experiment came back talking about how their parents were so impressed. They took them shopping. They gave them some extra privileges. They were just all glowing with all the good things that happened. And one guy, and I still remember the picture, this guy goes, oh no. And he wasn't the experimental group. He was just one of the kids. He goes, oh no. And I'm saying, what's wrong, John? Do you have a headache? He said, no, I'm just thinking. I said, thinking about what? He said, about what just happened. I said, what just happened? He said, that verse really means what it says. If I want things to go well with my life, I need to
Obey my parents and everything.
obey my parents. Now, you see where he's moving up the chart? He's responding to the phenomena, and he's starting to value the idea and see the value of implementing that into his life. And so then I say, okay, let's move up one more step. So picture yourself being out with your friends, and your mother calls outside, Johnny, it's time to come home. And you go, sorry, friends, I can't play anymore. I have to go home. My mom's calling. And they go, well, you can act like you can't hear. He said, no, I want to honor my mother and obey her, and I want to please God. Now, what would happen if you told all your friends on the playground that you were going to go home because you wanted to obey your mother and honor God?
They'd start teasing you.
What?
They might start teasing you.
They wouldn't say, my, what a noble young man you are. You are going to go far in life and have great success. No, his peers are going to do what they can to drag him down the ditch. Now, maybe some of his peers thought that's a neat thing he's doing, but they're probably not willing to talk about it on the playground. And you see what's happening? I'm trying to get him to organize his thinking to think, what happens when you're in the midst of a hostile group and you're practicing this stuff that God's talking about? And then, of course, the top line, you see why it moves up? Because we're moving up to this highest level of stuff where we just have this thing internalized to where if my mom calls after my dad passed away, if my mom called, no matter what I was doing or where I was, I answered the phone and said, what do you need, Mom? What's going on? What can I do to help? Because she needed some of the boys in her family, some of the men in her family to step up to meet the need in her life that was missing by the man in her family being gone, by the man in her life being gone. And I just did that. And I think my two brothers didn't feel comfortable doing it. Well, I wasn't very comfortable either. I go down to see my mom, and what does my mom want as soon as I walk in the door? She wants a big hug. I have never hugged my mom in my entire life. But boy, I started giving her hugs after my dad died. And I felt uncomfortable because it wasn't normal for me, but I knew it was the way to honor my mother. And then my mother starts cooking all my favorite foods and saying all these nice things about me. And my sister gets upset and goes, why does Mom always favor you when you come down here? And I just looked my sister in the eye and said, because she likes me better than she does you. I know that was wrong. I should have been above that. But I was messing with her a little bit, but just joking because she was the youngest and she was always a favorite and she knew it. And so when she saw it switching around, but then she realized, if Tom comes down here to do stuff for Mom, maybe I need to get over there and do more stuff for her if I want to have that kind of relationship with her too. So you see what happens? You just start to enter, you're working them up. So that's why it starts at the bottom and works its way up. Now, let's look at this. See these two handouts I gave you? Okay, you've got the one that says category on it. Okay, so here it is again. Receiving phenomena. And then it gives some examples and key words, like those handouts the other day. And then what's the next level up? Responding to the phenomena. And then it gives some examples and some key words. Then what's the next one after responding? Valuing. And it tells you what valuing is. And then it gives some examples and some key words. Cherish, Ephesians 6:1 and 2. Appreciate, Ephesians 6:1 and 2. Demonstrate, Ephesians 6:1 and 2. I love that one. So what would you see a person doing if they were demonstrating Ephesians 6:1 and 2?
Commend them. Like just tell them they were doing a good thing and that they're doing a good
And
job.
if you saw somebody doing it, what would it look like? In fact, could I even have little kids come into class and someone put on a hat like a parent and then somebody else come in and act like a child and do something to honor them?
Mm-hmm.
Demonstrations, initiates. Okay, what's the other page say? Organizing, that's the next level up. You see that? Gives some examples and it gives some key words. Compare what God says about how to live with what your friends would say on the playground. Relate what God says about how to live with the way most of the people that you know live who are your age. And then internalizing the values, some examples and key words. I act in accordance with Ephesians 6:1. I discriminate between those who practice and those who don't. And I got a proverb for you if you don't necessarily want to hear it, but I'm going to give it to you anyway. Bad company does what? Corrupts good morals. So if you got a bunch of friends who are bad-mouthing you for honoring and obeying your parents, you better get away from the bad company and find some new friends. Displays. What do you think happens when I take Bible concepts and teach it to my children to the point where it gets up here to this level and they're actually at home practicing this stuff in front of their parents, and they're practicing this stuff at church in front of their Sunday school teachers, and they're actually living this stuff out? I get phone calls from parents and pastors and say, I don't know what you people are doing at that Christian school, but I sure love what's coming out of it. And the whole idea is that we're teaching for application. I used to do workshops that said teaching to change lives. And now there's a place on the website, on the internet, where you can go where, what's it called? I think it's called Teach with the numeral 2, Teach to Change Lives. It's a website put together by a couple of Calvary grads over in, who work in Jordan, the Martins. Teach, the numeral 2, Change Lives. You might look that up sometime and see what you can find, because there's some very useful information there. They've been practicing this stuff out there, working with Child Evangelism Fellowship and working in a Bible college and doing over in Jordan and doing a lot of good things. Okay, that takes care of that. I know there's no way we can spend all the time we ought to with Bloom's taxonomy, but don't you like having those handouts with those verbs and those words, and it helps you see? And when you come into this stuff again, if you keep this stuff someplace close by, the next time you're asked about this to me is what's fun. You'll be asked about this somewhere when you go to grad school. And your teacher will say, most people aren't familiar with this. And then they'll say, have any of you seen these 3 kinds of taxonomies? And you raise your hand and they go, you have? Yes. Where did you study that? When I worked on my bachelor's degree. And then they'll say, where did you work on your bachelor's degree? Where you studied this stuff? And you will say, Calvary University. And they will go, wow, you went to a good school. I mean, I know that already, but you'll hear that down the road when you take this knowledge that you have and that you've kind of got a handle on, and you already know more than a whole bunch of people out there who just don't quite get it. Page 347. So that takes care of Bloom's taxonomy. Do you have any questions about those 6 kinds of things you're doing, or were those handouts perfectly clear or understandable enough to where you think you've got your questions answered? Good. And if you have a question about something, you can always go to the internet and keep searching around till you find some people. When I have a concept that I'm having trouble getting a handle on, I go to the internet and try to find people who are giving me examples of the concept, samples of the concept, and it helps me find useful information. Page 397, 347. The primary importance of Bloom's taxonomy is in its reminder that we want students to have many levels of skills. Instructional goals related to attitudes and values are called affective objectives. And you can Google that stuff and find this. Developing instructional objectives improves student achievement. When I write good instructional objectives in my lesson plans, it improves student achievement. And if I'm using Bloom's little checklist, then I'm going to make sure that I'm not just spending all my time at one level, that I'm moving on up the chain as much as I can. You can imagine, as a Bible teacher, when I discovered Bloom's taxonomy in the affective domain, I'm going, whoa, this is powerful stuff when you're teaching the Bible. Page 348. Student evaluations serve 6 primary purposes. Do you like filling out the evaluation forms here at Calvary to evaluate your professors?
Only if I feel like, I don't know. Sometimes I feel like they're a bother, but other times I appreciate being able to be anonymously honest about how I think the professor did and what I think they could do better to make a more effective class.
You know, I thought when I was a student here that those things were so useful that when I left here and became a teacher in a Christian school, I modified the form to fit the Christian school I was teaching and gave it out to students so they could evaluate my class, because I want to know what's going on inside my students' heads. I want to know what they're thinking about what we're doing in class. How am I going to make my class better if I don't give them an anonymous way of giving me input? And even as a teacher here, since we've changed the system where the evaluations are all online now and I don't get as much feedback, I asked the other day, would it be okay if I just take those forms and pass them out to students and have them put it in an envelope and seal it somewhere and keep it till give it to the department chair so that I can't look at it till after grades are turned in and read those things and take some class time to do it, because those are valuable to me. But I will tell you this, that in all the years I've been teaching here, I've had fellow faculty members say to me, I don't care what students say. What do students know? I'm the one who designs the class and puts it together. And I'm going, yeah, that's all true, but I want to know what the students are thinking, because then I can do a better job of getting inside their heads and helping them learn the valuable stuff I'm trying to teach them.
And that's why I don't like filling them out, because I feel like a lot of teachers either don't care, my opinion, or they care too much, and I'm afraid to say something that, like, well, this class wasn't really helpful because I already knew everything you were teaching, and then they're gonna be lost, or they're gonna
feel bad. And see, and after all these years of teaching, you would think, having all this stuff and doing this, that student evaluations, when they mail them to me, when I get the email that shows them to me at the end of the semester, I go, oh, go, I get a gig, not in my throat. I'm going, oh, it's time to read these again, because it's important to read this stuff and to stay up to date. And it's easy for me to slip into some kind of a mode that maybe isn't very productive without input from the students. And I have to remember not to let it devastate me, but not to dismiss it completely, but make a good use of that information. And somewhere, just figure out a way to say, somehow I want to get my kids to give me some feedback on how they feel or think about what we're doing here. And that's why I keep asking, so tell me some things about my lab. You know, what do you think about it? How do you compare it with other stuff you've done? And I appreciate your input, because it's just, it helps me know how much of this technology is helpful and how beneficial my lab is. But are you ready for this? Some of the people out there in the larger educational world, Pearson does my lab for a whole bunch of classes. And Pearson, it's a trademark thing with Pearson Publishing, and Pearson's my lab gets a lot of positive feedback from a lot of people, both professors and students. in other places. It's interesting information. And I checked some of that out before I even decided to have you buy it. And then when I got the reaction about, oh no, we're gonna have to spend all that money, I thought, wow, Tom, this is not the way to start a class when you're gonna teach this one class one time in the education department and help these people sort through this stuff. But I bit the bullet and said, so be it. So I won't see your evaluations, but please, please fill them out and be as candid as you can. Don't worry about hurting my feelings. I ought to be big enough to handle if I'm a teacher. And I promise you, I do not have the attitude that what students say doesn't mean anything. I value input from students. Now, what about us evaluating students? There are 6 primary purposes for me giving students grades. Feedback to the students, feedback to me as to how many of them are mastering what I'm teaching, information to the parents, information for selection and certification. What? Yeah, maybe they're doing so well they need to be selected to go into an advanced course. Or maybe they're on their way to earning some kind of certificate. Isn't that what a high school diploma is called? A certificate? Information for accountability. An incentive to increase student effort. Do grades ever make you work harder? I have someone in my math class who's just agonizing over this last test, wanting to get it all right. And I said, you've already got an A average going. So what if you bomb this last test? And they looked at me like, no way.
I used to be that person.
I want to make an A in this class so bad. I'm going, it's math, people. It's math. Who needs an A in math? Who even wants one? Can you believe I talk that way to people about this stuff? Because I know I live in a world where most people just aren't that interested in math. So I'm taking away some of the edge. Yeah, I want to earn an A in math. And by the way, that's the only class I want to earn an A in. The rest of them, I don't care. I don't need A's in those other classes. But in math, I want to earn an A there. Page 349. Students need to know the results of their efforts. Teachers cannot be optimally effective if they do not know whether the students have grasped the main points of the lesson. Parents need to know how well their children are learning. Evaluation helps students and teachers find strengths and weaknesses and select the appropriate courses of study. People use tests to qualify for promotions, for access to occupations. Tests are used to evaluate teachers, schools, districts, and states. What kind of test do you have to take to be a teacher?
A lot.
Tons of them, don't you? When I went to get my teaching certificate, I don't know how many times when I first started teaching, I was a pastor's major from Calvary. Okay, and I knew math because of my engineering background. I'd studied math up through Calculus 1. So teaching high school math and junior high math was not going to be a problem in terms of me understanding the content. But I would be doing stuff and I'd have parents say, are you a certified teacher? And see, to me, that was like growing up on a farm when somebody said, are you licensed to drive? It's like,
Sure.
I'm not old enough to get a license, but I can drive better than a whole bunch of people who have licenses because I've been driving for so long. And finally, I said to my wife, if one more person comes to me and says, do you have a teacher's certificate? I'm going to go get one so I can just say, yes, I do. And the end result was I ended up with 2 of them, one in Missouri and one in Kansas, because I got my master's degree here in Kansas City. And I said, there, I have 2 licenses. I can drive in Kansas and Missouri. They go, oh, really? And it didn't change what I did that much. It's just that now people think I've got the license to do what they're hiring me to do. And when I went to Illinois, I just said, I'm going to go to the university and get an Illinois driver's license, an Illinois certificate to teach. And the nerve of that lady at the certification office, you know what she said to me? She looked me right in the eye and she said, you have a bachelor's degree from a Bible college? I said, yes. What's wrong with that? She said, well, I'll tell you what's wrong with it. You should have never been allowed to earn a master's degree in education. She said, the University of Missouri in Kansas City should not have allowed you to become a certified teacher with your religious biases in life. And I wanted to say to her, with your anti-religious bias, you shouldn't be allowed to work in the certification office. But I didn't because I was trying to get one. And then she announced that you're going to have to do a ton of stuff to get your certificate in Illinois. I said, you know what? I can appreciate that, and I like going to school. So would you send me a letter with a list of all the stuff I have to do? Put it in print and sign your name to it. And then I'll go to the university and do it. But remember, if you require more of me than what you do of everybody else that comes in this door, just because I'm religious, that's called discrimination, and that can get you in a lot of trouble. Then I said, have a nice day, and walked out the door. And a week later, I got my letter that said, you must go to Illinois State University and take a 2-hour class, no, a 1-hour class in the summer on how to teach math to slow learners, and another one on how to teach math to the gifted. And once you've passed those 2 classes, we'll issue you a certificate. So I said, sign me up. But she didn't want me to have one because she didn't think any religious nuts, religious radical, Bible thumpers should be certified to teach in Illinois, because every teacher in Illinois should be secular to the core. Is that sad? It's crazy. I couldn't believe it. Okay, page 350 talks about formative and summative. I asked you that when we started this. And did you pick up on it in your reading here? Formative is indicates a need for additional instruction. It's what we do while we're moving through it, while they're forming their thinking. I'm testing them with formative exams. At the end of the lesson, after we've taught all this stuff, at the end of the unit, we have a summative test. To test at the end of an instructional unit, that's the difference between formative and summative. So what's the difference between norm referenced and criterion referenced? Well, norm referenced has to do with comparing the results with everybody else who took the test. Criterion reference says, here's the criteria. How close did everybody come to reaching that criteria? Norm referenced in education almost always is related to the normal curve. Any of you studied the normal curve anywhere in life? It's a cool phenomenon. If you just measure people's foot length, if you measure their shoe size, God seemed to make people with about 68% of them are right in the middle, 1 standard deviation from the mean, and the other 32% are half of them on one side and half on the other, extremely large feet and extremely small feet. That applies to a whole bunch of things in life. And so because it applies to so much, the people in education assume that it applies to intelligence too. That God made 68% of the people within 1 standard deviation of the mean. So if the mean is 100 and a standard deviation is 10, that means 68 out of 100 people have an IQ between 90 and 110. And then beyond 110, you have about 16 out of 100, and below 110, you have another 16 out of 100. Now, that might be true of the general population, but I need to ask you a question. Do you think that's true of the people in your classroom when you're teaching a group of students? Do you think that's true of the students on this campus in terms of their IQs? Probably, if we measure all the IQs of students on this campus, it would be shift more up to the top than down toward the lower part. You follow what I'm saying? So my problem with this normal stuff, this norming stuff, is that, so who has a class with a normal distribution in it? And one time I was discussing this with some of my peers, and I said this to a PE teacher, and he said, I do. He said, because when it comes to the ability to do physical things in phys ed class, you can see in a group of 30 students, you can see their abilities following the normal curve range. And I thought, I could see that happening. But I didn't see that in their math abilities. You follow what I'm saying? That not every ability lends it. For sure, the people who are in band would probably not follow a normal curve. It would be skewed one way or the other. So that means probably what we're going to do is a lot of criterion reference, which means we set a criterion and say, this is what I want people. This is a level that I want them to reach to be considered proficient. This is a level that I want them to reach to demonstrate mastery. And anything beyond that, that's fine. And then what do? Do I give A's to the people who have mastery and B's to the people who are proficient? No, our culture, the book talks about this in this chapter, our culture has so changed that C's used to be, a C is average. So now think about the normal curve. If C is average, 68 out of 100 students ought to be getting C's. You follow me? And the A's and the B's ought to be for the 16% above average. Not going to happen. The people in the 68% range, at least from the 50% on up, feel like they're entitled to a A or a B. So you see how things get skewed? Maybe the 16 people up at the top all get A's for sure, and then from the middle, from 50 up to the top half of that, that one standard deviation above the mean, they get B's, and then C's would be from the middle down one standard deviation, and then D's for those down below that. You follow how things have gotten skewed over time in terms of how we treat grading. And he'll talk about that a little later, which we'll talk about it too. Let's see. Page 354. Test items should measure learning outcomes. Tests should fit with the use of the results. Tests should be reliable. Tests should improve learning. Page 356 is a table of specifications. There it is, the table of specifications for writing test items. And then on page 357 is a nice little, and 358 and 359 and 360 are examples. Wow. So this book, you might want to screenshot some of those pages. I mean, I put down screenshot page 356, but you might want to screenshot some of those others, because it's like, hey, here's some samples. I can use this sample kind of as a prototype for how I put some things together. There's a whole bunch of questions on page 356. Do the items emphasize the same concepts you've emphasized in day-to-day instruction? See, it's like a series of questions. Remember that question? Remember that sheet full of questions I gave you to ask yourself if you want to be the best possible teacher you can be? Well, here are questions to ask yourself if you want to construct the best possible test you can construct. Does it cover all the levels of learning? Bloom's taxonomy. Have I overlooked anything? Does the language in the test correspond with the language used in teaching the lesson? Can you see how using standardized okay, can you see how using a test from the company might use different language than what I use in class? So I need to learn to use the language that's used on the test when I'm teaching. Are there clear instructions? Am I giving a reasonable time? Okay, so page 360 talks about true and false questions. What's it say? Well, here's what it says. You know what's the weakness of a true-false question? You have a 50% chance of getting it right whether you know it or not.
I hate true and false questions.
And, okay, just like my math test makes people hate math tests, the way that guy has all those bad choices up there. If I really write a good true-false question, I'll make a false statement sound true, and I'll make a true statement sound false. That's pretty sad, isn't it? When I thought about that, if that's what I'm doing, I think I don't want to do that. So I decided to get away from true-false questions and do something else. If you're going to use matching questions, each list should cover related content. We'll save page 361. No, we'll talk about it. Fill in the blank. Completion. Avoid ambiguity. Essay. There's a whole assessment strategy for essays, for assessing essays. They're hard to grade, but they really are valuable. And they give some examples on page 362 and 363. And then page 364 is problem solving. Organize students. Require students to organize, select, apply procedures, and give some examples. It seems to me like the best thing I can do when I'm trying to make math problems that will be most effective is I try to write problems that relate to life. And that's what I like about the math book I used. A lot of the problems relate to life. The only thing I don't like is, for some reason, the guy who wrote the book includes all these problems about beer drinking in there. But think of it. It's not, the book wasn't written for us. It was written to be used across the country. What's a popular activity on college campuses across the world? Beer drinking. So he puts beer drinking problems in there. I think it's more fun to use problems that have to do with shopping and church and playgrounds and stuff like that. All right. So there, we're up to page 367 next time, because we have to finish. That'll work. 367. That should give me enough time to finish the next chapter too. Oh. Yep, it's gonna work. I think. Yeah, it is. Yep.
The end is in sight. I just have to finish the 8-page paper and some MyLab stuff.